Hey guys, what's up? Nate Morris, MasterLSAT.com. I wanted to do a video explaining a question from PrepTest 71 that a ton of people seem to get wrong, and that is question 20 from the first logical reasoning section. It's the question about the Australian sheep farmers and wool sales, and I think that hopefully by the end of this video you'll see that fundamentally it's not necessarily a very difficult question. There's just some pitfalls that a lot of people seem to fall for. But as long as you read and think through it carefully, it can be a very easy and very predictable question. Now, if you haven't already tried this test on your own, if you haven't already done it, then I encourage you to first try this test, or at least this section on your own, do the best that you can, and then you can use this video to explain that one tricky question. Now, this video is taken straight from my course, which is over at MasterLSAT.com, where we go over every single question on this entire prep test, as well as many other prep tests. So if you like this explanation, then definitely check out the full video library over at MasterLSAT.com. And certainly like and subscribe if you find this video helpful, because we'll be releasing a lot more videos like this explaining tricky questions from different LSATs. So in the meantime, I really hope you enjoy this video and that you find it helpful.
Number 20, is this your card? This is a fun question because everybody picks A on this question, and we'll see why. I'll give you 3 reasons why A is wrong, so buckle your seatbelts. 3 reasons why A is wrong I will give you, and I'll also, equally importantly, show you how to predict the right answer. So, looking to resolve the paradox. We're going to read something that's a discrepancy, doesn't make sense, and we have to help explain it, help make it make sense. So let's see what the paragraph says. So adjusted for inflation, the income earned from wool sales by a certain particular family of Australian sheep farmers grew a lot between 1840 and 1860. Why? It's because the price for wool sold on the international market was higher than the domestic price, and they were selling more and more of their wool internationally. Makes sense. So far, everything makes sense, right? They made a lot more money from their wool sales during this period because they sold more and more of their wool internationally, where it commanded a higher price. So everything so far makes sense. So therefore, they made more money from wool sales during this period. Here's the discrepancy. But even though they generated more income from selling their wool, they failed to enjoy a commensurate increase in prosperity overall. They didn't really get any richer, even though they were making all this extra money, more and more money from wool, but overall they didn't get any richer. The discrepancy is really all in that last sentence, because it doesn't really matter why or how they made more money in wool, right? That's kind of almost secondary here. Really, the discrepancy is they made more money in wool, but they didn't make more money overall, right? So often just stating and identifying the discrepancy and why it's a discrepancy is enough to kind of see what the answer is going to be, right? Think about it. If I tell you they made more money from this one thing, from wool, but they didn't make more money overall, well, what would be the easiest way to explain that, right? If I told you that, let's say a store, let's say Walmart sells 2 things. They sell computers and beds. And let's say I tell you last year they doubled their revenue from computers, but they didn't make more money overall. Well, what would that have to mean? That would have to mean that they did worse, that they decreased their revenue in beds, right? Whatever else they sold must have done worse. If they did better in one way, but they didn't do better overall, well, they must have done worse in something else to even it out, right? That's the most obvious way to solve this discrepancy. If you're just thinking big picture intuitively, which you always should be on this test, then you'll see that, right? If they made more money from wool sales, a lot more money from wool sales, but they didn't get richer overall, well, they must have lost money on something else. So that's probably what we want to look for in the answer choices. So anyway, let's go ahead. Remember, the answer is not A. I already gave that away. I'm sure you know because you've done this question, but let's see why. A, does A resolve the discrepancy? A says that at the end of the 1800s, prices generally in Australia rose more quickly than did the wholesale price of wool sold domestically. Now, as I mentioned, there are 3 reasons why A is wrong. I would love it if you pause the video and try to find as many of those 3 as you can. And I'm going to assume you've done that. And I'm going to try to now tell you these 3 reasons why A is wrong. First of all, the most obvious reason, which everybody misses, even though it's staring you right in the face, what's the time period that we're talking about in this paragraph? 1840 to 1860. So as soon as you read the first 6 words of A, it's already irrelevant. At the end of the 1800s, we're literally talking about the period smack dab in the middle of the 1800s, 1840 to 1860. That's, by no definition, is that the end of the 1800s. That's literally right in the middle, right? So telling me something that happened at the end of the 1800s is going to be irrelevant to explaining this paradox. So that's one thing, right? That's the simplest. Another thing that's wrong with A, even if you corrected that, even if it said in the middle of the 1800s, between 1840 and 1860, prices in general in Australia rose more rapidly than did the wholesale price of wool sold domestically, that still wouldn't matter. How do I know that? Because this family, specifically the reason they were doing so well is because they were not selling as much wool domestically. They were selling more wool internationally. That's why they did well. It's because they were selling more and more wool internationally. So telling me something like A, which is that the domestic price for wool wasn't doing so well, we already know that. And they were ditching the domestic wool market. They were selling more and more internationally, and the international wool market was doing great. And so therefore, the fact that the domestic prices weren't doing so well is irrelevant to this family. That was the whole point of the paragraph. That's another reason why A is wrong. And finally, the third reason, which one of my students pointed out to me once, is that it starts off the paragraph by saying adjusted for inflation. And so therefore, A is saying prices in general rose more rapidly than the wholesale price of wool sold domestically. Even if you corrected for those two other issues with A, even if you were talking about wool sold internationally, well, telling me that prices in general rose more rapidly than that would be irrelevant because we already adjusted for inflation. We already adjusted for prices in general. That's what inflation is, right? If everything goes up together. So we already adjusted for that. And yet, they still made more money. They still managed to stay on top with the wool sales. And so therefore, for those three reasons, A is simply not going to work here. B, does B solve the paradox here? B says the prices of wool sold to domestic markets by Australian farmers decreased a lot during this period in question. No, this doesn't help us out because the whole point of this paragraph was that these people were not selling domestically. They were selling internationally. That's why they were doing so well, because international prices were much better and they were selling more and more internationally. And that's why they made more money from wool sales, right? So telling me that the domestic markets were not doing so well, great, we already knew that. That's why this family was selling internationally probably, because they wanted to get the better market, the better international price. So the domestic markets are less and less relevant to this family, right? Because they were selling more and more wool internationally. That's one reason why B is wrong. And anyway, we already know that they made more money from their wool sales. So we can't try to explain, well, maybe they didn't make as much money on their wool sales as you think. No, we already know. We can't contradict with the paragraph. The paragraph already told us that they made more money from wool sales from 40 to 60, right? So we can't contradict with that. Whatever is true of the wool market, they made more money from wool, but they made not more money overall. So therefore, the only way to solve this is by telling us that they lost money on something else other than wool. So anyway, I think you can see why B is wrong. C is perfect, and it's exactly what I told you should be looking for on a question like this. C says the international and domestic prices for mutton, sheepskins, and certain other products produced by all Australian sheep farmers. Remember, we're talking about a family of Australian sheep farmers. So according to C, the prices of other things that they sell, that all Australian sheep farmers sell, that they produce, fell sharply during the period in question. So this is exactly what we were looking for. According to C, other things, yes, they did better in wool, but other things that they also produce, mutton, sheepskins, etc., the prices fell sharply during this period in question from 40 to 60. And so therefore, C exactly explains why they wouldn't enjoy a commensurate increase in prosperity. Even though they were making so much more money from wool, according to C, they were making a lot less money on a whole bunch of other stuff. So therefore, they evened out, they broke even, and they didn't really get any richer. Perfect. It's exactly what we were looking for. Now, here's the thing with C. A lot of people look at C and they think it's irrelevant. Mutton, sheepskins, that was never mentioned in the paragraph, so they kind of just write it off. They don't really give it the time of day. They don't really consider it. And that's kind of a trick because you shouldn't be afraid of novel information, especially on discrepancy questions. When you're solving a discrepancy, you're specifically looking for a new piece of information, right? If you were to just restate something from the paragraph, how could that solve anything? The paragraph is a discrepancy. It doesn't make sense as it is. You need a new fact in order to resolve it. As long as they tie it in and they make it relevant, then that's going to answer the question. So don't be afraid of new words. Ask yourself, if this were true, would this answer the question? In the case of C, it would, and therefore C is right. D says that because of competition in wool sales during this period, Australian wool producers were worse off than previously. Wool producers in Australia generally were worse off. The problem is this doesn't explain anything because we already know that this family was better off. So just because Australian wool producers in general were worse off, let's say in 1860 than they were in 1840, we know that that wasn't true of this family. This family, we were told explicitly point blank from the paragraph, the income earned from wool sales by this family grew substantially between 1840 and 1860. So even though if D were true, then that would mean that Australian wool producers in general were in a less favorable position. Well, we know that this family came out on top, right? So we already know that they made more money from wool sales. Whether other families didn't or not, or whether the general wool industry did poorly, it doesn't matter. Clearly, this family was unaffected. Clearly, they made more money from wool sales. And therefore, D wouldn't help explain anything, because at the end of the day, even if the wool industry did poorly in general, or declined in general, we already know that this family did better. And so therefore, this won't help explain why this family didn't get any richer. The discrepancy is that even though this family made more money from wool sales, regardless of what happened with the rest of the industry, this family made more money from wool sales, and yet this family didn't get any richer. That's what we have to explain. So telling me that the rest of the wool industry didn't do well, which is what D is doing, is not going to help explain this. E says that among these Australian sheep farmers, the proportion that made their living just from international wool sales increased a lot during this period in question. Well, this doesn't help us out, right? Because if that were the case, well, that's good for them, because international wool sales clearly were doing well during this period. The price was much better than the domestic price. But this doesn't help explain why this family didn't get any richer, right? E is telling us about Australian sheep farmers in general. We know that this family was selling more and more wool internationally. Again, as I said in the breakdown video, it's not really so relevant. The point is that at the end of the day, at the end of the story, this family made more money from wool, right? So whatever Australian sheep farmers were doing in general, from international wool sales, domestic wool sales, with the proportions, whatever, at the end of the day, we know that this family made more money from wool. The discrepancy is that even though they made more money from wool, they didn't make more money overall. They didn't get any richer overall. So the only way to explain this would be to say that they lost money on something else, right? So E is kind of irrelevant. It doesn't help explain this discrepancy. According to E, if I read E, I still have this giant question mark. Okay, fine. So Australian sheep farmers were getting smarter. They were selling more wool internationally. Okay, fine. But why was this family not able to enjoy more prosperity? They were making more money, right? So E doesn't answer the question. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.